Good evening, everyone. My name is Neil Levesque. I'm the Executive Director here at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. We're here live. We have an auditorium filled with our students. I'm sorry you can't be with us tonight. Obviously, we're on Zoom because of the pandemic, but we're very pleased after 12 years to welcome back General David Petraeus from his first appearance here at the Institute of Politics. Special night. I just want to go through a couple housekeeping items. The first is that this is being recorded. The second housekeeping item is if you have a question for General Petraeus, if you could submit it through the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen. We'll take as many questions as we possibly can. Tonight, doing our interview is Phil Taub. Phil is a shareholder in a nationally known law firm based out of Manchester, New Hampshire. Phil, most notably, is the founder with his wife of Swim with a Mission, which is a charity which has been dedicated to veterans, particularly those in the Navy SEALs. And Phil, you are the absolute perfect person to do this interview. We're very particularly pleased to have you tonight. Phil, take it from here.
Neil, thank you so much. Really an honor to be here with the General and with you and representing the college. So thank you very much. I'm going to begin by introducing David H. Petraeus. It's hard to do this justice in just a minute or two. You're hard pressed to find a greater American who has done more for our country and frankly just done more. It's really incredible. But let me try quickly. General Petraeus is a partner in the global investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute. Prior to joining KKR, General Petraeus served over 37 years in the United States military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, including command of the surge in Iraq, command of the U.S. Central Command, and command of forces in Afghanistan. Following retirement from the military and after confirmation by the Senate in a vote of 94-0, he served as director of the CIA during a period of significant achievements in the war on terror. General Petraeus graduated with distinction from the United States Military Academy and later earned a PhD from Princeton University. He has held academic affiliations with the U.S. Military Academy, the University of Southern California, Harvard, and the City University of New York. He is currently a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale, an honorary professor at the University of Birmingham, a member of the Trilateral Commission and the Aspen Strategy Group, co-chairman of the Global Advisory Council of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and senior vice president of the Royal United Services Institute. Over the past 15 years, General Petraeus has been named one of America's 25 best leaders by U.S. News and World Report, a runner-up for Time Magazine's Person of the Year, twice a Time 100 selectee, Princeton University's Madison Medalist, Prospect Magazine's Public Intellectual of the Year, and 3 times one of Foreign Policy Magazine's top 100 public intellectuals. General Petraeus has earned numerous awards and decorations, including 4 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Medal, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, 2 NATO Meritorious Service Medals, the Combat Action Badge, Master Parachutist Wings, and the Ranger Tab. He has also been decorated by 13 foreign countries, and he is believed to be the only person while in uniform to throw out the first pitch of a baseball World Series game and do the coin toss at the Super Bowl. So General, thank you again for joining us here. And as Neil pointed out, you last spoke at the college on March 24th, 2010. And before we started here, you were just reminiscing about that. Maybe that's a good place to start. Tell us, reflecting on that experience and what that was like.
Thanks very much, and it's great to be back with you all, even if it is virtually, especially since I was a resident of New York, or of New Hampshire, for a number of decades while we were moving around the world while I was in uniform. I remember going to St. Anselm, and keep in mind that, you know, I'd been deployed for, at that point in time, I guess it was about 5 of the previous 7 years or so. And we showed up there, and I was looking around the green room, and I noticed 30 cameras outside, TV cameras. I remember they gave me the count, and I was looking around the green room, and there are all these presidential candidate photos. And I said, oh my gosh, have we ever gotten ourselves into something here? I can just see what the White House will do with this. But it was a wonderful occasion. I disappointed 30 camera operators that with it not making some announcement I had never intended to run for office, and still don't. But it was a very, very stimulating event, and I'm delighted to be able to return. And I thank Neil for the kind welcome back and the invitation. And Phil, I want to thank you for both moderating this and also for what you're doing in supporting our veterans.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. So since 2010, General, and I understand back then you talked about Iraq and Afghanistan and the war on terror. I want to start right off the bat here with Afghanistan. You know, a lot of veterans that I talk to, and myself, I'm not a veteran, but I too was upset about the timing and the circumstances of our hasty withdrawal, especially being right around the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Would love to hear your perspective, you know, looking back on the war in Afghanistan and our hasty withdrawal.
Well, as you noted, my final assignment in uniform before becoming the CI director was commander of US and coalition forces in Afghanistan. It was at the height of the war, of course. This is the period of the buildup that was ordered by the Obama administration after their very in-depth policy review in 2009. We felt that we were accomplishing the missions. We believed strongly we were. We had the evidence to support that at that time. But I should note that right off the bat, it took us all the way until sometime in late 2010 to actually get the inputs right in Afghanistan. I've actually recently been looking at, for my own purposes and perhaps publication, something that might be titled, you know, the top 10 reasons for our underperformance in Afghanistan. Keeping in mind that I'd just come from Iraq, had commanded the surge, and there we drove violence down by some 85%, really put the country on a new trajectory, which was really sustained for a good 3.5 years after the end of the surge, and even after the withdrawal of our forces. It was their actions, the Prime Minister's actions, that undid what it was that we had achieved together. When it came to Afghanistan, though, I always felt that it was a much, much more challenging situation. In fact, when I was a 3-star general in Iraq, on my way home from my second tour in Iraq, Secretary Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, asked me to come home through Afghanistan and to do an assessment of the situation there. And when I came back in the PowerPoint briefing, and of course, you know how generals communicate is with the aid of PowerPoint, I laid out on the very first slide, it was titled, Afghanistan does not equal Iraq. And what I was trying to lay out there is the context, even though Iraq was already vastly more violent, and it got far more so until we got that under control in the first 6 months of the surge. Even though the violence was vastly greater there, the conditions were such that if you took a certain number of steps, there was a really quite a good prospect that you could, again, get the country on a good trajectory. Afghanistan was vastly more challenging. Unlike Iraq, it had very little infrastructure. It had virtually no money. Iraq could actually generate $100 billion in oil revenue if you could actually get the pipelines piping oil instead of being blown up and the electrical towers back up and transmitting electricity. Afghanistan, very high illiteracy rate. Iraq was relatively well educated by contrast. And most important of all, really, is that Afghanistan, the enemies were beyond your reach. The Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, the Haqqani Taliban, these other groups, Al-Qaeda, were all in sanctuaries on Pakistani soil. And with the exception of Al-Qaeda and to a degree the Haqqani network, we're really not allowed to go after them at all. And nor would the Pakistanis get them out of their soil, nor would they take care of them. So this was a massive challenge. And I realized that over time, you know, I never used the word win in either of those countries, but I felt, relatively speaking, that you could achieve much greater progress in Iraq, and you could almost win in Iraq, where you did not have the prospect of that in Afghanistan because of all of these differences. Afghanistan also didn't have a history of strong central government. Iraq obviously did, and on and on. So the challenges were very, very substantial there. And my sense as it went along was that, you were not going to be able to win in the classic sense. What we should do is to try to manage the situation. And I would contend that we had actually reached that point, that with 3,500 troops from the US, 8,500 from coalition countries, yes, we had 18,000 contractors that were critical to sustaining the Afghan Air Force, that was the core of which was very sophisticated US helicopters and some fixed wing aircraft. But that was an affordable, I felt, a sustainable commitment that could actually be sustained, because the cost in blood and treasure to us was not unaffordable at all. In fact, we'd had no casualty, no loss on the battlefield for something like 18 months before that tragic suicide bombing at the entry control point to Kabul International Airport during that very chaotic period of evacuation. And so I had counseled that that's what we should do, is to continue the effort. I understand, again, certainly the previous president was sufficiently frustrated to agree with the Taliban to a departure date, which would have been even earlier than what this administration did. I disagreed with that as well. By the way, I should point out to everyone, especially given that St. Anselm's Institute of Politics, that I don't register, vote, not a party affiliation, don't endorse or contribute to candidates. But in this case, I'm going to be critical of the serving administration. Again, I felt that both the decision to withdraw rather than to sustain a sustainable commitment was inadvisable. And in fact, when I heard the announcement of the final decision, I said that I fear that we will come to regret this decision. I suspect that we have. I don't think you're going to find folks in Washington that will necessarily acknowledge that. And then clearly the execution of the withdrawal left a lot to be desired. At the very least, we should have pushed the timing way into the winter when you're not in the fighting season. There were a variety of other issues that obviously that could have been done in other ways. But I feel that we have, and there's a very, very comprehensive article in The Atlantic by George Packer, a longtime student of all of this, also of Iraq, spent a good bit of time with him over the years. I think, and rightly, I think it is quite critical of the way this policy was decided, the failure to take care of those who risked their lives to serve alongside our soldiers on the battlefield, in particular, those who were battlefield interpreters for 2 years or more were authorized, and we gave them the right to apply for a special immigrant visa and to get them and their families out of the country, because their lives were at risk because of what they did to us, especially with our withdrawal when the Taliban would take over. I also thought that it was more than predictable that we would see what happened there. I said 3 months prior to the end that I feared a psychological collapse of the Afghan security forces when they realized that their helicopters and fixed wing aircraft weren't coming to the rescue with reinforcements, emergency resupply, aero medevac, and then also close air support. And that's because once I learned of the withdrawal of the 18,000 or so contractors that kept this very sophisticated equipment operational, it was very predictable that at the rate that they were flying at very, very high operational tempo, almost beyond what we could have sustained with our organic and contractor support when we were in Afghanistan and with large units. So there's just no way this is going to stay operational, and it did not. And when the Taliban hit the security forces around the country simultaneously in a number of different places, the reinforcements couldn't respond. These other elements of support did not show up. And as predicted, the Afghan forces realized that. And if that's the case, then they're going to cut a deal, as did the political leaders of these different locations in which these forces were deployed. So again, I feel that this was, it was, as you said, heartbreaking. It was tragic, and I think in many respects disastrous. Keep in mind that this is also allowed China, potential adversaries around the world, to say, look, we told you you can't depend on the US as a partner, and we told you the US is in decline. I don't believe either of those, and I am very impressed by what the administration is doing in assembling all of our allies and partners to put Vladimir Putin on notice about what will happen if he further invades Ukraine, and so forth, and a variety of the other actions actually around the world. But in this case, we did hand, again, those who wish us ill, an opportunity to call into question our dependability as a partner, our greatness, if you will, as a power in the world. Again, I think folks in Washington are painfully aware of that. We still have this unmet moral obligation to those who served alongside our soldiers. By the way, I'm on the board of advisors of No One Left Behind, an organization that focuses on helping those who qualify for a special immigrant visa, both to get evacuated and then get resettled in the United States. We have names of roughly 60,000 or so individuals plus family members, and there are many, many tens of thousands of others whose lives are at risk because they served in other capacities which might not have qualified for the special immigrant visa, but certainly put their security in grave jeopardy, as the Taliban are literally going house to house hunting for some of these individuals. Of course, this has also meant that we have consigned a population of 37, 38 million people to a horrible winter and a horrible future, a return to a 7th century interpretation, ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam. Over 1 million people have left just into Pakistan alone. There's widespread starvation. Needless to say, the economy has collapsed. And tragically, we didn't go there so that girls and women could go to school and college, but it was a wonderful outcome. And many of these gains, needless to say, have been completely reversed or wiped away.
General, thank you. That was a great summary. I just one more question about Afghanistan. You know, looking into the future, would you be surprised if you saw the United States going back to Afghanistan?
I'd be surprised to see us put boots on the ground there again, other than, say, security around the embassy. If we reopen the embassy, which is something I think we should do, even if we don't recognize the Taliban as a government. It's something that's very, very problematic given their ideology, their practices, the really quite abhorrent principles to which they subscribe. But be that as it may, this is again a country of 38 million people, roughly, again already down by at least 1 million, who have been consigned to a life of very, very harsh privation, a lack of adequate basic services, and others. And it's not inconceivable that you could see forces in there in some capacity to assist. And then, of course, obviously, we're going to have assets that are over it, around it, perhaps even in it, who will be conducting intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to make sure that the Islamic State, which really got a shot in the arm by the release of about 1,000 of their fighters that had been captured in Afghanistan and were in various prisons throughout the country, and the Taliban released prisoners from all of the different locations, detention facilities. They got a shot in the arm, and of course, Al Qaeda is still got its global headquarters, if you will, in the area of the very western mountainous areas of the Pakistani tribal areas. And also a bit of an affiliation with the Taliban and the Haqqani network over the years. So I think it's very worrisome that this could be, once again, a sanctuary for transnational extremists, the way it was when Al Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks there and conducted the initial training of the attackers there. Keep in mind, the reason we went to Afghanistan was that the Taliban refused to eliminate that sanctuary. So we went in and had to do that. And to do that, we also had to topple the Taliban regime.
Right. Thank you, General. I want to switch topics now to Russia. And you mentioned Putin briefly. Help us understand, this Russian aggression. We're seeing it obviously in the Ukraine with, I think, over 100,000 Russian troops, on the border there. The ground is getting hard, winter's coming. But help us understand what Putin is doing, like why is he doing this now, and what should our administration be doing to mitigate this aggression that we're seeing?
Well, let me start with the latter, because I think in this case, the administration is actually doing quite an impressive job to essentially to dissuade, to deter Vladimir Putin from taking actions that could completely unhinge the security situation in Eastern Europe. Even though Ukraine is not a member of NATO, obviously a number of the countries in its border and in Eastern Europe are all NATO allies. There is the Article 5 pledge that an attack on one is an attack on all. And it's, of course, why we're moving additional forces to Europe, posturing others in case the NATO rapid response force is called on, and so forth and so on. But also the preparation and the work with all of our allies and partners around the world, not just our 29 NATO allies, but also in the EU countries, but even countries farther from Europe than that. And again, I think it's been quite an impressive diplomatic effort around the world to marshal all of that and to put Putin on notice as to what would happen in terms of response to some kind of aggression by Russia. This has actually been going on since last spring. The positioning of these forces, Putin has a variety of different objectives in mind, we think. One certainly is that he does not want Ukraine to succeed. And if you want to discourage investors from investing in a country, just surround it with 100,000+ Russian forces and see how quickly they stop taking an interest in that. At a time when Ukraine really had an opportunity, if you will, to attract considerable outside investment, because it's a country with enormous resources in a variety of different ways. He fears very much a successful democracy, a successful free market economy on his border. Again, a vibrant Ukraine, a prosperous Ukraine would be an example for his people of everything that Russia is not. Were it not for the extraordinary amount of crude oil and natural gas that he's able to export, of course, he wouldn't be anywhere near in the position that he is. That does enable him to be a very, very substantial autocrat to meet reasonable needs of the people, but certainly not providing the freedoms that we cherish, basically locking up or trying to poison or kill his would-be adversaries, journalists, and so forth. Of course, Navalny is in a prison right now, his most effective opponent, if you will, in a political sense. So he very much wants to see Ukraine fail. He also really feels that it is part of the historic Russia. He'd love to have it back in the fold. He feels that there is a fair number of Russians in Ukraine, of course, but he has, by his actions, actually really turned many, many Ukrainians against him who were not against him prior to the occupation of Crimea and the support for the separatists in the southeastern part of Ukraine called the Donbass. And that has actually turned them against him in a way that was not the case necessarily beforehand. He also loves to stride the world stage. He feels that he hasn't gotten his due. He hates to hear when somebody says it's a middleweight power or a gas station with guns to describe the country, or a gas station with nukes, more accurately, which is also not particularly accurate. I mean, it is a very, very substantial power to be reckoned with. And he has shown a willingness to use his forces in many different locations, not the least of which, of course, are Ukraine, the invasion of two parts of Georgia back in 2008. In fact, during the surge, when we had a Georgian brigade that we had to get home pretty quickly as a result of that. He's propped up Bashar al-Assad in Syria when he was teetering on the throne in Damascus. He's played active roles in a variety of other places. His paramilitary groups, they are active throughout Africa, the so-called Wagner group, and also in Syria and a number of other locations. So he's been willing to use the assets that he has. And again, he wants Russia to be a country to be reckoned with, again, to, as I said, stride the world stage. And he really does feel in his heart of hearts, we believe, that he meant what he said back in the previous century when he acknowledged, when he observed that the worst day of that century was that which saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he's tried in a variety of different ways through different means and mechanisms, the Eurasian Economic Union, for example, this collective organization that he has for security, which involves the Central Asian states that used to be Russian republics. So a variety of different means and initiatives to try to reassemble the Soviet Union in some way, and also to show, frankly, that he is a dependable partner, as we saw when Kazakhstan asked him in to help put down some of the unrest that was taking place in its largest city just in the previous month. So all of this is what's going on. He also has used this occasion to, of course, put substantial numbers of forces on the soil of Belarus, on his border, a country that has its own domestic internal problems of very substantial size. And again, to bring Belarus closer to Russia, to embrace them in a way that they really had been resisting in the past, but now have succumbed to. So that's what's taking place there. And clearly what the administration is seeking to do is, together with all of our allies and partners, which is an approach that characterizes everything that this administration does do, including that to develop the relationship with China first and foremost, but getting everyone together so that Putin understands the enormous economic consequences if he does indeed pursue further aggression against Ukraine.
Thank you, General. I want to talk a little bit about China. You know, I think our relationship with Russia in some respects is easier to understand than the complexity of our relationship with China, right? We didn't fight a Cold War with China, for example. And, you know, Putin seems to be better known to the American public than what we see in China. But do you see parallels with Taiwan? I mean, China's made, you know, no secret of their desires to take Taiwan at some point. You know, looking at what we're dealing with Russia and the Ukraine, do you foresee a time when we'll be doing something similar with China and Taiwan?
Well, one obviously hopes not. And indeed, if you really come out now and look at the truly geostrategic landscape and look at what the administration is seeking to do, from the very outset, their biggest goal is to, together with all of our allies and partners around the world, including some that had felt a bit bruised in the previous 4 years, to bring everyone together and to develop a coherent and comprehensive whole of governments, with an S on the end, approach to China, to seek to cooperate with China in areas where we can, such as climate, economy, combating the pandemic, and so forth, to compete with them pretty fiercely in other areas, including a number of different economic areas, and then where necessary to dissuade, to deter actions that could result in true conflict. And of course, something involving Taiwan would fit that description. The administration, in fact, was on a pretty good trajectory in the early months, probably the first 4 to 5 months, or even a bit longer of their administration. Afghanistan then blew us off that trajectory, and it really just dominated everything for a period of time. I'm sure it literally sucked the air out of the Situation Room, as we used to say occasionally. And it was only after that we could get back to this, but now with the bruising that resulted from that, because keep in mind that many of our European partners, if not most, really wanted to stay in Afghanistan, didn't feel that they'd been thoroughly consulted. They felt that they were just told. And I made 3 trips to Europe last fall and found that very, very stark, these feelings that were there. And then again, the way that, of course, we went out also struck them. But then we could get back to this, and we're moving along again. That has to be, you know, this is the biggest plate. I think it's useful, in fact, to use the analogy actually of the guy in the circus who has to keep a bunch of plates on sticks spinning. And we're the most important of those people in there doing that. But we have a lot of help from a lot of allies and partners. Some help more with some plates than others. And those plates, the biggest of all, the one that's probably bigger than all the others and that can never even wobble, we hope, is that which represents the collective relationship with China. But there are other plates. There is a plate, obviously, for Russia. There's one for Iran and its nuclear program, its nefarious activities in the region, its missiles, and so forth. There's a plate for North Korea, which has been more active recently. There's a plate for Islamist extremists. There's cyber threats. There's domestic political challenges for many of the democracies around the world, including our own. In a variety of course, there's a COVID plate, there's a climate plate. So all of these, and I think what distinguishes the current time, in fact, is not just this extraordinary rise of China, not just that we're past the unipolar moment where the US stood alone astride the globe. The real distinguishing feature of the contemporary times, I think, is just the sheer complexity and number of challenges that we face, the number of plates that we have to keep spinning around the world. But again, keep in mind that the one that matters most is the China plate, and that we have to look through a prism every time we take any action around the world and ask, how will this possibly affect that particular relationship? And again, to come back to Afghanistan, which you started with, again, I fear that because of the potential effect on China. Now, I don't believe it is correct to assume that we are an undependable partner or by any means that we're a power in decline. We've got our challenges without question, but the economy is roaring back. There's a lot of vibrancy and all the rest of that. And I think it would be very unwise for Vladimir Putin or Iranian supreme leader or someone to misjudge the will of the United States. And I think the administration is keenly aware of the need to be seen as a dependable partner in the wake of Afghanistan, and they're intent on doing that. And I think they're doing a very, very impressive job when it comes to Russia. I think also crafting the policy for China. The members of the administration, I think, though, would be the first to acknowledge that there's a glaring absence, which is the absence of a trade component to that coherent, comprehensive whole of government's approach. And they'll try various ways without being able to return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership because of domestic political challenges in that regard. But again, I think they're quite intent on this. And again, the work to try to achieve a return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement, the nuclear accord with Iran, is another very important step. And indeed, the operation that took place the previous night that the president announced today, a characteristically very, very impressive operation by our special operations forces, undoubtedly by our intelligence community to pinpoint the location of the individual, and a pretty gutsy call by the president, I think, to decide to put our forces on the ground to take him out, to try to avoid the kind of civilian loss that some of which took place nonetheless, because he blew up the entire floor of the house so that we couldn't take him. As did the previous ISIS leader, I might add, Baghdadi blew himself up as well, rather than being captured. But again, I thought quite an impressive operation there as well. And all of this, again, this is a country, again, very much to be reckoned with. And those who misjudge, I think, the determination of the country or extrapolate from one issue to others that are unrelated in large measure, do that at their own peril.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I really like your analogy of the spinning plates, because I was going to apologize for jumping around and asking you a variety of questions here, but we only have you for an hour.
That's what you have to do.
Really,
again,
yeah,
what the country has to do. And for what it's worth, I mean, this is what I do in the world of investment, is we assess geopolitical risk. We integrate the macroeconomic, environmental, social, and governance risks and issues together with those individuals who are actually assessing it from a purely financial perspective to present it to our investment committee. And, it's a company that owns 110 companies around the world and has a minority interest in another 100 or so. And that's very, very intellectually stimulating work and very relevant work indeed to what we're talking about right here.
Yeah, so General, let's talk about the spinning plate that's COVID. It landed on our shores uninvited, started in China. And, since it arrived, it initially wreaked havoc with our healthcare systems. We're still seeing the effects on our supply chains. It initially shut down our economy, right? I think our government has spent record amounts to alleviate the effects, to fight COVID. There's a lot of contradictory information. I mean, I think of myself as a fairly well-informed, well-read person, and I can't quite get a handle on, is this true? Is that not true? A lot of issues have been politicized, unfortunately. And so, as a four-star general, student of a lot of this stuff, from your perspective, what lessons do you think that we should be learning from all of this that'll help us address the next threat that we get from a virus?
Well, let me use the sort of an intellectual architecture, I guess you might call it, for strategic leadership to describe this or to illustrate this. And you mentioned one of the affiliations I had. I was a fellow at Harvard for 6 years at their Belfer Center. We built at the Belfer Center a website on strategic leadership. And we used the surge in Iraq as an example of how to apply this model that I'll describe. Also Netflix, by the way, and a number of other commercial enterprises. But essentially, a strategic leader has to perform 4 tasks and has to get them right. Most importantly, you have to get the big ideas right. You have to then communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the population or the unit or what have you, the organization. You have to oversee their implementation. And then you have to sit down and determine how the big ideas need to be refined and then do it all over again and again and again. We've gotten some of these right. I think the bipartisan consensus to spend a great deal of money to provide relief for those most affected by the pandemic and the shutdowns and all the rest of that very wisely spent. The effort to develop vaccines and so forth, some of which was done by the companies themselves, others that took federal money to pursue that. But then there were lots of examples where we did get it right, where either the big ideas, in a sense, weren't right initially. I mean, early on, the question about whether or not to wear masks. Now, to be fair to the medical community, I think they were afraid that if they said everybody should wear a mask, then there wouldn't be those for the medical health professionals. But ultimately, of course, there's a recognition that that should be a component in what is being done. The CDC and others actually put out, I think, pretty good set of guidelines, but of course they got muddled in transmission. And then the example and so forth and the oversight of this was not always present, to put it mildly. You have the challenge in our country that it's not just one major healthcare system. It's, at least 50. It's actually even more than that because you have state and even university and private and all the rest. So you've got to figure out how do you bring all that together. We didn't do that particularly well. And then we even, again, when it came to procurement of supplies and so forth, again, something where we could have imposed various federal mandates or federal authorities on this so that you don't end up with states or, again, private systems all competing with one another, trying to cut deals in China on their own, where you would oversee all of this and then allocate what is available, what is procured in terms of priorities rather than in other terms. So again, look, there are a lot of hard lessons that we need to learn from this. Again, I would come back to this, get the big ideas right, communicate them effectively. And we had very muddled messages, and then it got politicized and that made it even more challenging. Oversee the implementation. You got to drive a campaign plan. You literally have to just, very, very determinedly. This is what it took to get the surge in Iraq done. The leader might try to make it look, as if it's, light hand on the reins or all this stuff. But let me tell you, that's not the case at all. Again, you really do drive the conduct of a campaign, and that very important one. And we formally used to do this in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where we'd sit down with the lessons learned team chiefs that would come in and they'd tell us, hey, you need to refine, we didn't call it the big ideas, but various components of our civil military campaign plan. And that's what needs to be done. That's a construct, if you will, an intellectual construct for thinking about this. And again, I think if you subject various of our experiences under the previous administration, and then indeed under this one as well, you can see a host of areas where we should learn lessons and where we can make improvements.
Thank you, General. And you mentioned our special forces taking out the leader of ISIS, which President Biden announced yesterday. So I want to switch gears again with you and talk a little bit about this. So, when you were leading the fight, and since then in the war on terror, right, we saw an increased use of our special forces, right? Technology changed really fast, how we gathered information, how we use that information, the use of drones, cybersecurity, which you mentioned as well. Now we see more and more countries going to space, and hypersonic weapons and so forth. Really just want to get your view looking forward. What do wars of the future look like for our country and around the world? And do you see the role of our special forces changing in that fight?
Well, the role will change. They have a role to play if you get into sort of, major conflict again between so-called peer competitors. It's a very, very different context, needless to say, than what it was that we were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. That said, again, keep in mind all these little plates that I said that we have to keep spinning. A number of these you have to keep an eye on Islamist extremists. Again, it's very significant that our special operations forces brought the leader of the Islamic State to justice. But keep in mind, we did that before. We took away the entire Islamic State caliphate, enabled actually Iraqi and Syrian partners to do that with our capabilities, which were already transforming how, frankly, we fight because of the advent of drone, literally a constellation of drones that we have. But what we should look to in the future is increasingly unmanned systems, and they may not even be remotely piloted. There's going to come a time where they will be semi or even perhaps fully autonomous, and where the ability to have the human in the loop may actually start to become the conditions that are in the algorithm, which guides the actions of these again, robots on ground, at sea, subsea, in space, and in the air. And I think that's what we will get to eventually. I don't know when you start to see robots fighting robots instead of, fighters fighting each other, band fighters and so forth. But you can certainly envision that. That is certainly coming. And we're closer to that, I think, than people realize. We have done a variety of different experiments with the different military services and indeed in the commercial sector to increase the activities of robots and again of unmanned systems, remotely piloted, even again, autonomous systems. That is the way of the future. And the machine that can most effectively identify the enemy machine and take action in response will be the one that prevails. And of course, you're going to have the same thing. We already really have the same thing going on in cyberspace, where many of the cybersecurity tools are essentially machines. They are operating on algorithms. The more sophisticated ones are actually learning and changing what it is that they do based on threat information and threat activities. And some are even in the world of artificial intelligence, where they're not just doing machine learning, they're literally starting to change the learning of what is going on. They're really they're piloting new capabilities again in cyberspace. So that's what the future holds, and it's going to be very, very different from what it was that I was privileged to oversee, if you will, in commanding our forces in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and the greater Middle East.
Thank you, General. I've got one more question for you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Neil Levesque, who's going to ask you some of the questions from my audience. And really, this is my favorite question. I was saving it for last, General. So you've had nothing short of an exceptional career. It really is incredible what you've achieved in such a short period of time. And, there's a lot that probably goes into a career like that. And we have a lot of students in our audience today. And I would be grateful if you would share some lessons that maybe they could apply to their own personal and their professional lives that, maybe they can follow in some of the success that you've had.
Well, sure. Look, I mean, all someone can do in this kind of situation is state things that folks will have heard before, but maybe you try it in a slightly novel way. And I think the first would be to observe that, life is really a competitive endeavor. This is not young little kids soccer. You don't get a trophy just for showing up. There's no t-shirt just for, again, you don't win something by, again, just participating. You win by winning. There was a great company commander I had when I was a battalion commander. And I remember he came in one day and he said, sir, winners win stuff. And, it sounds, I said, that is truly profound. And, on the one hand, it's a glaring statement of the obvious. On the other hand, it is very, very profound. And in fact, in that battalion and every other unit that I was privileged to lead, we really did try to win stuff. And in that battalion, I mean, we won a whole bunch of categories of stuff. I'm still smarting from the fact that we only came in second in the chili cook-off in the Hopkinsville, Kentucky host Fort Campbell event. And I'm only slightly tongue-in-cheek in that regard. So you really do have to commit. Again, success doesn't generally sort of fall into your lap. You don't stumble your way to victory. You have to really put everything that you have into it. And there's an awful lot of shortcomings that can be overcome by sheer hard work, application, focus, good interpersonal skills, all the rest of this. That's what the ingredients are, again, of at least the chance of achieving something fairly substantial. I'd also point out that, luck does play a role, and folks would say, Petraeus is lucky. There he was in the 101st when they invaded Iraq, and that caught people's attention. They sent him back and he sort of did okay then. And so when they're really desperate in the surge, they call his number again and do it again in Afghanistan. Well, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And you can spend a lifetime preparing to make the most of an opportunity. It doesn't mean it necessarily comes along. You'll certainly do better by all it is that you have done to prepare. But if you're not prepared, I can guarantee again that is going to pass you by without being able to fully capitalize on the opportunity at hand. And then the final thing I would offer was some reasonable personal experience in this regard, and that is that life is just not endless high five moments. It comes with adversity. You make mistakes. I did, certainly. The organizations you're privileged to lead, individuals will make mistakes. And what you've got to do after those is sit down, determine what happened, why did it happen, how did it happen, make amends as required, and then above all, learn from it. Pick yourself back up, the organization back up, dust yourself off, and get back in the ring and start going at it again. Again, the real mark of an organization is how does it do when it confronts adversity. And getting through that, again, requires the kind of just sheer commitment, determination, fortitude, and so forth that is often, these are the hallmarks of great organizations and also of generally of great leaders.
Thank you, General. I mean, we certainly do learn more lessons when we fail, it feels like, than when we succeed, right? So I'm glad that you mentioned.
And again, you should have built into your organization's battle rhythm, in other words, how you spend your time, your calendar. One of those elements is that fourth task I mentioned, which is to formally sit down and determine what do we need to refine when it comes to these big ideas? How do we need to evolve? I mean, just always think of the case of Kodak, which actually had over 2,000 patents on digital photography, but failed to pull the trigger fast enough to make the transition from film to digital photography, and literally is not the great company that we knew back in the film photography days. So you not only have to recognize that what the future might bring, you've got to try to get there first and you have to make changes. And those changes are to the fundamental big ideas, the fundamental strategy, and so forth that guide your organization.
Yeah, well said, well said. So Neil, I'm going to turn this over to you. I haven't left you a ton of time, but maybe one question, maybe two.
Yes, so we got a lot of questions from our audience. I'll try to sum up the heart of several of them. And one of them is, do you think there are any long-lasting political repercussions for the U.S. not sending diplomats to Beijing Olympics? And describe your concerns, if you will, with the relationship with Putin and Xi.
Well, the first is something, again, that the administration sat down and I think one of the lessons learned, from a previous boycott back in the past was that you really shouldn't deprive your athletes of an opportunity for which they've worked an entire lifetime. This only comes along every 4 years. They have spent, again, their entire life to that point in time, undoubtedly preparing for it, and certainly don't want to deprive them. And the administration still wanted to make a statement about the concerns, to reflect concerns it has in a variety of ways about Chinese practices. And so that's the way in which they sought to do that, and then galvanized a handful of other countries to do the same. The relationship between Putin and Xi, I think in the past was one that, and really between China and Russia, is one that you would have characterized as transactional, where I don't think China, President Xi, sees Russia as being, again, remotely in the orbit of China, which has achieved such extraordinary economic growth. I mean, what they've done in the past 42 or 43 years since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China is really historic, at least for a large country. There are other countries, South Korea, for example, even in that same period, that actually achieved greater per capita GDP, again, over roughly the same period. But in terms of just an enormous country, the largest country in the world, 1.4 billion people right now, to do that is just unprecedented and extraordinary. And so I don't think, again, that China remotely sees Russia as, again, a peer in really many particular aspects, with the exception perhaps of the production of certain defense capabilities. But what you do see is a little bit of a convergence in certain ways in how they see the world ideologically, in their desire that other countries shouldn't have a say about others' domestic activities, not necessarily certainly be in agreement with the principles, the values, the guidelines that have generally been the way that the world is sort of organized and acted since the end of World War II, when the US, together with the victorious countries, essentially established the so-called rules-based international order. Also in some respects in wanting to redraw boundaries and that kind of thing. And so you do see a bit of convergence there. By the way, I am not one who says this is a new Cold War with China. I think that analogy is actually unhelpful, because the original Cold War between the US-led West and the Soviet-led East was one in which there was virtually no economic trade to speak of. And China is, at various times, it's always one of our top three trade partners, and we theirs. Sometimes it's number one or two, depends what's happening, of course, with Canada and Mexico, who are the other two of the top three. So in that regard, again, there's enormous activity economically in the trade world, and a variety of other relationships as well. Although there are also undeniably areas in which there is a decoupling that is taking place. It started certainly with the World Wide Web, with the establishment of the Great Firewall of China. There are a variety of other activities, obviously Facebook, Twitter, Google, now LinkedIn, and others are not active there, and on and on. And I can list a variety of different actions in other areas in which this is taking place, not just those of sensitive technologies and chips and so forth. And that is very concerning. Again, it is something that we either have to come to grips with China, because there's reasons why this has taken place, or it is going to continue further. And, President Xi, who is on track to, in the fall, be reelected for an unprecedented third term as the president of the country, if there is a time when he feels sufficiently domestically strong to take actions where there could be greater mutual benefit, that would be the time. And it will be very revealing to see what indeed does happen, because, of course, in Washington, there is the emergence of a bipartisan consensus that we needed to be firmer with China. The previous administration very much changed the conversation on China, as they say. And again, that's a bipartisan sentiment in our nation's capital. So this is a very, very difficult period in that relationship. And the next few years will tell how it does evolve from here, and whether China will be willing to engage in the kind of dialogue that again, President Biden would like to pursue together, with all of our allies and partners around the world, to the extent that they possibly can be, being together with us and on board with what it is that we seek to achieve.
So we have time for one more question, and I'm going to summarize. I got a lot of questions about sort of one topic, and so I'll put it all together. The students here asked, what accomplishment are you most proud of? But also, how do they get into the foreign policy world that you're so schooled in? Obviously, there must be much more to this than just your participation in the armed services, but also, where did you gain this breadth of knowledge, and what are you most proud of in your public service?
Well, I mean, gosh, you can, say, hey, our kids turned out wonderfully. By the way, our son served in Afghanistan, and he was actually a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader when I was the 4-star commander there. And he went back multiple additional times with Special Operations Forces. And proud, he just finished a JD MBA at Harvard and is in a big law firm in New York. His wife, by the way, was an Afghan war veteran as well, on the ground with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and leading her second startup. Was Harvard and Rhodes Scholar. And just, again, I think the biggest legacy any of us leave is, that of our children. And I'd speak glowingly of our daughter and son-in-law as well, and now 3 grandkids and so forth. But, if you say in public service, I think in my case, it really has to be connected to Iraq. And I think therefore it would be, because I spent 4 years of my life there, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star. And the surge in Iraq was really quite a substantial endeavor. And it was an extraordinary privilege, the greatest of possible privileges, to be asked to lead that effort by President Bush, and to do so together with Ambassador Ryan Crocker, the greatest diplomat of his generation, in my view, as well. That was a country that was on the verge of a Sunni Shia civil war. It was in that situation really in various parts of the country already, in the particularly most contested areas of Baghdad. And what our young men and women in uniform, together with our coalition forces and Iraqi partners, did was really quite historic, to pull a country back from the very, very brink of a civil war, to drive violence down by some 85% or so just in those the 19 and a half months that I was privileged to command that time. And then it went down further over the next 3.5 years. So I think that's really, at the end of the day, again, if you ask what will you remember most, I think it has to be that, because it was the most significant to our country at the time, and because the President of the United States made an incredibly gutsy call, largely against the advice of most of those in uniform at that time, including those who were actually on the ground. And so again, to have that kind of responsibility, authority, and support, I might add, was really unique. And, my dissertation actually looked at military advice on the use of force. So it's not inaccurate to say there was an unprecedented set of circumstances. For those that want to get into the foreign policy world, the national security world, and all the rest of that, the key is to have a point of penetration, as you do in an attack. You got to get in somewhere, and then you have to prove yourself. And that can happen in a variety of different ways. I'm very, very supportive of internships. What many people won't know is there are actually interns, college interns at the CIA, I got to know a lot of them because one of the initiatives I pursued when I arrived at the CIA, again, I'd never been in the organization before. I knew a lot of the individuals, the operators who were the chiefs of station and others, and had been with me on the battlefields and so forth. But I sought to reach out, and I thought I had a variety of initiatives. One of those was called Run with the Director, and I thought everybody would sign up. The only thing was you had to be able to run, I think it was 6 miles in under 7 minutes, because that was the pace at which you could talk comfortably. And not a lot of hands went up, to my surprise. But I got to know all the college interns because they were largely the ones that were capable of doing that. That program is fantastic. By the way, the most successful program I had was Eat with the Director, and that everybody's hand went up for that. So if you want to get to the agency, start early, because again, the process, if you wait until you graduate from college, it can be another 1.5 years just to get through all of the different hurdles and clearances and investigations and all the rest of that. And so I strongly recommend any of these. Just get in somewhere, do it at state, do it at the Department of Defense. Treasury has a lot of these activities. There's a host of departments and agencies in which I think you can find these very, very stimulating, rewarding, even gratifying kinds of opportunities to contribute. And then once you get in there, show what you can do. There are these moments where somebody, I remember the Chief of Staff of the Army, I was his aide, and I'd been there just for a couple of months, and we're driving home. I would go in and back with him, and he turned to me and he said, "Hey, here's this white paper. We're going to issue it tomorrow morning." He said, "The reason I hired you, because you're a smart guy," and so forth. And he said, "I want you to take a look at it." I knew this thing had been going on for months, and I'd actually been looking at it, and it had all the hallmarks of a document where every 3-star and 4-star had his little pet rock inserted in it, and it didn't fit together all that well, and it wasn't that coherent or that smooth, even though he had brilliant speechwriters, but they're getting trumped by all the people that said, "You got to have that in there, Colonel." So I was only a major, but I took that home. He said, "Call me at 8 o'clock." I called him at 8 o'clock, and he said, "What do you think?" And I explained what I've just said to you here. He said, "Well, come on over to the house." So I went over, and I'd marked it up. It was a good 15 or 18 pages, single space, all over the place. He looked through it for a good 15 or 20 minutes, and he said, "You now have the pen. I'm telling the two guys, the head speechwriter and the head thinker, designated thinker, to be in the office at midnight. Here's a new copy they just delivered to me. Mark that up, meet them at midnight." And he said, and I said, "Okay, Chief, you got to tell them that I get the right, if you will, to decide who wins the tie if there's a disagreement." And so we worked feverishly on that thing until I think 6 in the morning. We didn't have high-speed printers in those days. You had to take it to the printing press. Got it printed, bound, and I met him, took a shower, and met him in his quarters at 6:45 or 7 or something like that to go in with him. That's the moment that you have to be ready for. And again, in a sense, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. I'd already been through grad school, I'd already been a speechwriter, already been engaged in a variety of other activities. But when those moments arrive, you've got to be ready for them. And you have to make the most of them as well. This is not in a careerist way or an ambitious way. This is just what you need to do. And so I think that's the essence of this. And to get to any position of real responsibility, that's what you sort of have to demonstrate. But you've got to get your foot in the door first, figure out how to do that. There's a lot of ways that you can figure out how to do that. And then, of course, once you get in there, again, you've got to prove yourself, and that's the key. And again, life is a competitive endeavor, but if you're prepared for that moment, it can prove to be your opportunity.
Great advice, General. Thank you very much for participating tonight. Let's not wait another 12 years for this to happen. We welcome you back to New Hampshire, particularly in person. And Phil Taub, thank you very much. Particularly though, I think we thank you, General, for your service for all these years. This was an enlightening event and very, very interesting for our students in particular. So thank you. And thank you all for participating today. Look forward to the next event. Thank you.
Privilege is mine. Thanks. Thanks. Great to be with you again, Neil. And thanks very much, Phil, for moderating.
Yeah, thank you, General. Thank you, Neil.